The morning sun filtered through ancient oak trees as I stood on my porch, coffee in hand, surveying the land that had become my sanctuary. After escaping the concrete jungle 3 years ago, this rural retreat represented everything I worked for: peace, space, and freedom. The 5 acres of rolling hills, backing up to a small stream, had been my redemption after 20 years of corporate servitude. Every morning, I walked the property line, greeting the day with gratitude for the solitude this place provided. I first noticed something was wrong when I spotted unfamiliar tire tracks cutting across my east meadow. Someone had driven straight through my property without permission. I followed the tracks to my back acreage, where several survey stakes were disturbed, some completely removed, others shifted several feet from their original positions. A sick feeling settled in my stomach as I examined the tampering. These markers had been deliberately moved. The next day brought my first encounter with Regina Carson, the newly elected president of the Oak Meadows Homeowners Association, from the subdivision that bordered my property to the south. Her silver Mercedes kicked up dust as she drove directly onto my land without invitation, parking with entitlement just yards from my front porch. Regina exited her vehicle with clipboard in hand, designer sunglasses perched on her nose despite the cloudy day. "Good morning," she called with artificial brightness that did not reach her eyes. "I am Regina Carson, president of Oak Meadows HOA. We need to discuss some concerns about your property boundaries." I introduced myself politely, though confusion clouded my thoughts. My property was not part of any HOA. It predated the development by decades. "There seems to be some confusion," Regina continued, flipping through papers on her clipboard. "According to community bylaws, the rear portion of your land actually falls under our jurisdiction. The previous board never enforced this, but I intend to correct that oversight." My politeness evaporated instantly. "That is not possible. My deed clearly shows." "Your deed is outdated," she interrupted, pointing toward my back acreage. "The watershed easement grants communal access rights, which our legal team interprets as HOA jurisdiction. We will be reclaiming what rightfully belongs to the community." The confrontation ended with her ominous promise and a patronizing smile, as she handed me a stack of official-looking papers before driving away, leaving me standing in a cloud of dust and disbelief. I initially dismissed her claims as ridiculous overreach, setting the documents aside to review later. 1 week later, a certified letter arrived containing a cease and desist order regarding unauthorized use of community property, and a fine of $2,500 for violations of landscaping ordinances on land I had owned for years. Additional notices arrived daily, each more outrageous than the last, citing obscure regulations that supposedly applied to my property despite having no connection to their association. My attempts to reason with the HOA board were exercises in futility. At each interaction, I was met with circular logic-referenced rules that did not exist in any public record, and told that my attitude was making matters worse. Each board member seemed to read from the same script, their eyes avoiding mine as they repeated Regina's assertions about my property boundaries. The final straw came early on a Tuesday morning. The unmistakable sound of heavy machinery jolted me awake at dawn. I rushed outside in pajamas to find construction crews installing a massive iron gate across the access road to my back acreage. When I demanded they stop, the foreman showed me a work order signed by Regina Carson and stamped with official-looking seals. Standing before that newly installed gate blocking access to my own land, I felt something inside me break and reform, harder, more determined. This was my property, my dream, and I would not surrender it without a fight. The battle lines were drawn, and Regina had no idea who she was dealing with. The county record's office became my second home over the following weeks. Day after day, I pored over property documents dating back to the 1950s when my land was originally parceled from a larger farm. The musty smell of old paper filled my nostrils as I traced boundary lines with my finger, comparing them with the HOA documents Regina had provided. The discrepancies were not subtle. They were deliberate and calculated. "These coordinates have been altered," I muttered to myself, spreading the original survey next to the HOA version. The watershed easement Regina mentioned existed, but it granted limited access rights for maintenance, nothing close to ownership or jurisdiction claims. After exhausting the public records, I invested in hiring Martin Grayson, a land surveyor with 40 years of experience in the county. The expense stretched my already tight budget, but I needed professional confirmation of what I already suspected. "I have surveyed this region for decades," Martin said as we walked the property line together. His precision instruments confirmed my suspicions with scientific exactitude. "Someone has systematically altered or removed your original survey markers. This stake here, it has been moved nearly 12 feet from its registered coordinate." His weathered face grew grim when I showed him the HOA documents. "This is deliberate misrepresentation," he muttered, marking the true boundaries with fresh stakes painted bright orange. "Your property has never been part of any HOA jurisdiction. The Oak Meadows development was built 15 years after your parcel was established." Martin provided me with an official survey report and certification of the correct property lines, evidence that would prove invaluable in the fight ahead. Armed with this information, I scheduled a consultation with Patricia Winters, an attorney specializing in property disputes. Her office felt cold despite the warm day outside. Patricia reviewed my documents with a methodical eye, her expression growing more serious with each page she examined. "Regina Carson sits on the City Planning Commission," she revealed, setting down her reading glasses. "And her brother-in-law owns Pinnacle Development Corporation. They have been acquiring properties throughout the county for a new commercial project." The pieces clicked into place with chilling clarity. This was not just a power play. It was about money. Regina was attempting to use her HOA position to devalue and ultimately acquire prime real estate through intimidation and fraud. "This will be an expensive and difficult legal battle," Patricia warned. "They have connections throughout local government, and your resources are limited. We can file injunctions, but be prepared for delays and obstruction at every turn." My investigation expanded beyond legal channels. Online searches revealed Regina had a history, 3 previous neighborhoods, 3 similar conflicts, 3 families who had sold their land under duress after prolonged harassment. I spent hours tracking down these former victims, collecting contact information for potential witnesses. The most disturbing discovery came in the form of a small lockbox hidden in my shed wall, left by the previous owner and forgotten until my thorough search. Inside were threatening letters dating back 5 years, warning of community action if the owner refused to sell the back acreage to an unnamed developer. The postmarks coincided with Regina's arrival in the area. I methodically photographed every boundary marker, every document, every instance of encroachment. I installed trail cameras in trees along my property line, documenting regular trespassing by HOA board members who believed themselves unobserved. Regina herself appeared in several images, pointing and directing others as they surveyed my land as if it were already theirs. The gates blocking my access road were not just physical barriers. They represented calculated steps in a long-term scheme. As I compiled my evidence, I realized I was uncovering something far more sinister than neighborhood overreach. This was organized, systematic fraud targeting multiple properties over years. "Document everything," Patricia advised during our second meeting. "Build your case methodically, and be careful, these people have resources and connections." I left her office with a heavy folder of legal options and a heavier heart. The battle ahead would require more than just law and facts. It would demand strategy, patience, and a willingness to fight dirty against opponents who had mastered the art. The community center buzzed with artificial lighting and whispered conversations that halted as I entered the monthly HOA meeting. My carefully organized presentation folder felt heavy in my hands as I signed the attendance sheet, noting the curious glances from residents who clearly recognized me as an outsider. Regina presided over the board table like a monarch, her perfectly manicured nails tapping impatiently on the polished wood surface. 5 other board members flanked her, their expressions ranging from boredom to open hostility as I approached the podium during the public comment section. "I have prepared a presentation regarding the property boundary dispute between my land and the Oak Meadows HOA," I began, voice steady despite the knot in my stomach. "I have documentation proving my property boundaries have been incorrectly represented in recent HOA communications." I proceeded to present irrefutable evidence of property line manipulation, including Martin's professional survey, historical records, and the original deed establishing my land decades before the development existed. My voice remained calm and professional as I demonstrated the discrepancies between the registered survey coordinates and the altered versions appearing in HOA documents. The response was immediate and coordinated, like a performance rehearsed multiple times. "Point of order," interrupted a thin man I recognized as Regina's appointed secretary. "This matter involves pending legal issues and cannot be discussed in open session." Before I could respond, another board member objected on procedural grounds, claiming my presentation violated bylaws requiring advance submission of materials, a rule that existed nowhere in the publicly available regulations. "We will table this discussion for further review by our legal team," Regina declared with a sharp bang of her gavel. "Next agenda item." My protests were ignored as the meeting moved forward, my evidence left untouched on the table. After the meeting adjourned, I approached individual board members, hoping to find someone reasonable enough to acknowledge the clear evidence. Board member Thomas Harrison, a gray-haired man who had remained silent throughout the meeting, briefly made eye contact as I approached him in the parking lot. He glanced nervously over his shoulder before leaning close. "She has something on everyone," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I could lose my business if I cross her. I am sorry." He hurried away before I could respond, leaving me standing alone under the harsh parking lot lights. My next attempt at resolution came through the County Property Dispute Resolution Service, a mediation program designed to resolve boundary conflicts without court involvement. I filed the necessary paperwork, paid the fees, and arrived at the appointed time with my evidence organized and ready. The mediator, a balding man named Richard Greenwood, seemed professional enough until he mentioned his previous work with the City Planning Commission. A quick search during our break revealed he had served alongside Regina for 3 years and attended the same country club as her brother-in-law. The mediation concluded with a recommendation that I consider the community benefits of allowing HOA access to my land. Each day brought new indignities: anonymous calls at midnight, tire tracks across my front lawn, noise complaints filed with the sheriff about non-existent violations. Every attempt at reasonable negotiation met a brick wall of coordinated obstruction. The escalation continued relentlessly. I received notices from the county about improper trash disposal on days when my bins were empty. Animal control arrived to investigate reports of neglected livestock on my property. I owned no animals. Each complaint required time and energy to disprove, draining my resources and patience. The morning I discovered my custom-built mailbox smashed to pieces was the final straw. The wreckage bore spray-painted letters spelling "accident" in a color matching the paint used for Oak Meadows' HOA signs. The message was clear: resistance would be crushed by 1,000 small cruelties. I stood among the splintered wood and twisted metal, understanding that diplomacy had failed. If I continued attempting to reason with unreasonable people, I would be ground down until surrender seemed like the only option. It was time for a different approach, one that Regina and her cronies would never anticipate. Rain drummed against my kitchen window as I spread documents across the table, creating a web of connections with red string and pushpins. The past month of confrontation had taught me a valuable lesson. Direct opposition against Regina was futile given her connections and resources. A new strategy was required, one built on patience, misdirection, and meticulous planning. Document everything. Build your case methodically, my attorney Patricia had advised. Her words became my mantra as I developed a multifaceted approach that would appear as surrender while actually strengthening my position. The first step was creating the illusion of defeat. I called Patricia from my landline, knowing Regina likely had connections who could access phone records, and loudly discussed dropping the boundary dispute due to financial constraints. The next day, I visited the county clerk's office and ostentatiously retrieved my complaint paperwork, making sure to sigh heavily within earshot of the receptionist who played tennis with Regina's sister. My public retreat was carefully choreographed. When Regina drove past my house, I made sure she saw me slumped on the porch, dejected and seemingly broken. When board members encountered me in town, I avoided eye contact and hurried away as if ashamed. The community whispers shifted from conflict to pity, exactly as I intended. Behind this facade of capitulation, my real work accelerated. Under cover of fog and pre-dawn darkness, I installed weatherproof cameras in trees and outbuildings, angled toward the contested boundaries. These high-definition devices with night vision capability would become my unblinking witnesses to every trespass and manipulation. I contacted an attorney from the neighboring county, one with no connections to local politics, and established attorney-client privilege before sharing my complete evidence. She agreed to prepare necessary documents while maintaining absolute secrecy about our arrangement. My online investigation into Regina deepened. Tax records, property transfers, business registrations. Every public document revealed another thread in her web of influence. The pattern became clear. She had orchestrated similar disputes in 3 previous neighborhoods, each resulting in landowners selling under duress to companies linked to her brother-in-law's development firm. My phone calls to these former victims were initially met with fear, then cautious interest, and finally cathartic anger as they recognized the pattern matching their own experiences. She called code enforcement on our barn renovations 17 times, one woman recounted, her voice still tight with frustration 3 years later. We never had a moment's peace until we sold our back 5 acres at a loss. 6 months later, it became a shopping center. Another former victim, an elderly man who had lost riverfront property through similar tactics, agreed to provide a sworn statement about the harassment campaign that had forced his family to relocate. A retired judge provided crucial insight over coffee at a diner 30 miles away from local gossips. The HOA has overreached its jurisdiction, he confirmed after reviewing my documents. Your property predates their covenant. Document their trespassing. That will be your strongest legal position. Each night, I updated my battle plan. The cameras recorded daily incursions onto my property, board members examining the land, workers moving boundary markers further onto my property, Regina herself directing these activities with confident impunity. Each trespass strengthened my case while they believed I had surrendered. I established covered pathways and concealed routes to access my back acreage without being observed. Through careful observation, I identified blind spots in their surveillance, gaps in their attention that would prove crucial to my counter-strategy. When forced to interact with Regina, I maintained the appearance of defeated resignation. I waved politely when she drove by, shoulders slumped in feigned submission. I avoided confrontation at community events, nodding meekly at her triumphant glances. Behind my smile lay the patience of someone preparing not just for a skirmish but for total victory. The cameras recorded daily trespasses, each one strengthening my position for the reckoning to come. While they believed they were watching me crumble, I was documenting every violation, building a case so overwhelming that even Regina's connections could not save her. The strategic retreat was not surrender. It was the calm calculation of someone who understood that sometimes you must appear to lose the battle to win the war. As spring rain washed away the last snow of winter, my resolve hardened like steel being tempered in fire. Regina believed she was dealing with a broken opponent. She would soon discover how wrong she was. The art of deception requires patience and attention to detail. My plan entered its next phase when I began loudly complaining about financial troubles at the local coffee shop, within earshot of Regina's close friend who worked the morning shift. I mentioned potential bankruptcy, medical bills, and the possibility of selling my property, just to get out from under all this trouble. The following week, I implemented phase 1 of my strategy, visibly relocating valuable equipment away from the contested area. I rented a trailer and spent an entire Saturday moving my tractor, tools, and other equipment from my back acreage to the front portion of my property. Regina watched from her SUV parked across the street, barely concealing her triumph behind designer sunglasses. "Just cutting my losses," I called out when she pretended to be checking her mail. Her satisfied nod told me she had taken the bait perfectly. At the local diner the following Thursday, I loudly discussed financial hardships with a friend, a performance for the benefit of HOA board member Edward Miller, who sat 2 booths away pretending not to eavesdrop. "The back acreage is just not worth fighting for anymore," I lamented, making sure my voice carried. "With all these environmental concerns showing up in the soil tests, maybe I should let them have the headache." Edward's fork paused midway to his mouth. I had planted the seed perfectly. The environmental report, a masterpiece of forgery complete with official-looking headers and concerning soil sample results, accidentally fell from my folder at the gas station where Regina's husband worked. He retrieved it, eyes widening as he scanned the contents showing potential contaminants in the groundwater beneath my back acreage. As expected, the document disappeared rather than being returned to me. Meanwhile, my true strategy unfolded in the shadows. The imposing gate they had installed became the centerpiece of my plan. While appearing to accept its presence as a barrier, I constructed hidden access points and camouflaged pathways that allowed me complete freedom of movement without detection. Under cover of darkness, I created a false wall section in an old shed that appeared locked and abandoned, but actually concealed a pathway to my back property. I established a hidden tunnel beneath a drainage culvert, uncomfortable but effective for accessing the contested area without being observed. Most crucially, I modified the gate itself, creating a section that appeared permanently welded but could be silently opened and secured again without leaving evidence of entry. The gate had become more than a barrier. It was now my most valuable asset. While the HOA believed they had successfully cut off my access, I moved freely across my entire property, maintaining it through secret routes while allowing the visible portions to appear neglected and abandoned. Motion-activated cameras captured everything. Regina instructing workers to move deeper onto my property, board members discussing development plans for land they did not own, and late-night visits to remove remaining survey stakes. Their voices carried clearly in the night air, incriminating conversations preserved in high-definition video as they became increasingly bold. Once we clear this section, we can begin the soil testing for the foundation, Regina told her brother-in-law during one particularly damning visit. The environmental issues were a lucky break. It will drive down the sale price when he finally caves. The irony of her reference to my fabricated environmental report made me smile as I reviewed the footage. They were now using my deception to further their own, creating a trail of evidence that would prove impossible to explain away. The most valuable recordings came during a private HOA board meeting held on my property, a breathtaking display of arrogance as they discussed their plans while standing on land they were actively stealing. "We should have the title transfer ready within 3 months," Regina assured the gathered board members. "The legal team says his missed response deadlines constitute abandonment of claim. Once the court confirms our easement rights, Pinnacle Development can begin work immediately." Board member Thomas, the same man who had whispered his apology months earlier, looked uncomfortable. "But this is still legally his property. The surveys clearly show." "The surveys show what we need them to show," Regina interrupted sharply. "No one will question the documentation once the development is underway. Trust me, this strategy has worked before." Every conversation, every trespass, every admission was cataloged and added to my growing case file. As they became convinced of their victory over what they perceived as a broken opponent retreating from battle, their caution dissolved into carelessness. For 3 months, I maintained my deception, appearing defeated in public while secretly documenting every violation. The gate they believed imprisoned me had become the symbol of their overconfidence. They had no idea that their victory celebration was premature, or that every step deeper onto my property only strengthened the case that would ultimately destroy them. The state investigator's office felt appropriately serious, wood paneling and fluorescent lights illuminating 3 hours of documented violations. Senior investigator James Harmon reviewed my evidence with growing astonishment, his eyebrows raising progressively higher as I presented video evidence, falsified documents, and testimony from previous victims. "This is extraordinary," he finally said, closing his notebook with a decisive snap. "We have suspected organized fraud in development projects across 3 counties, but never had evidence this comprehensive. This connects several open investigations." With state authorities now engaged, I moved forward with the next phase of my counterstrike. The timing needed to be perfect for maximum effect. The HOA's monthly meeting provided the ideal opportunity, a public forum where Regina's power was most visible and where her downfall would send the clearest message. I arrived at the community center not as a supplicant this time, but flanked by my attorney Patricia and a court-appointed process server. The room fell silent as we entered, conversations dying mid-sentence as people recognized me and registered the official presence accompanying me. Regina's face registered annoyance at my arrival, then confusion at my companions, and finally alarm as the process server approached the board table with a thick envelope of legal documents. "What is the meaning of this interruption?" she demanded, voice sharp with authority that was about to be stripped away. My attorney stepped forward, her voice clear and professional. "This is a formal complaint alleging criminal conspiracy, property rights violations, and fraud," she announced to the stunned room as legal documents were placed before each board member. "It includes cease and desist orders regarding the contested property boundaries, restraining orders against specific individuals, and notice of criminal complaints filed with the State Attorney General's office." The community erupted in whispers and pointed fingers as Regina's face drained of color. She attempted to call the meeting to order, but her gavel strikes were lost in the growing commotion. "This meeting is adjourned pending legal review," she finally announced, attempting to gather the papers into her briefcase. "Those documents must remain with the individuals served," Patricia informed her calmly. "Attempting to remove them constitutes interference with legal service and obstruction of justice." Regina stormed out, leaving the other board members staring at the legal documents before them, with expressions ranging from shock to resignation. Thomas, the board member who had warned me months ago, caught my eye with a small nod that might have been respect or relief. That evening, my security cameras captured Regina and two board members attempting to remove the gate under cover of darkness, adding attempted destruction of evidence to their mounting legal troubles. The footage was immediately forwarded to Investigator Harmon and added to the growing case file. The county commission meeting the following week became standing room only as residents from 3 neighborhoods arrived to witness my presentation. I had notified local media of the gathering storm, ensuring public scrutiny would prevent backroom maneuvering to bury the case. I presented my evidence methodically: property records, fraudulent documents, video of trespassing and conspiracy, testimony from previous victims, and financial connections between Regina, board members, and development companies that had profited from similar schemes. The commissioner's expressions shifted from political neutrality to genuine concern as the pattern of abuse became undeniable. The county attorney requested copies of all evidence for a separate investigation into ethics violations by public officials involved in the conspiracy. Outside the meeting, longtime residents approached with their own stories. "She tried the same thing with our pond last year, and thank you for standing up to them." The dam of fear had broken, releasing a flood of similar accounts that reinforced my case. Regina launched a desperate counteroffensive: accusations of evidence tampering, character assassination attempts, and veiled threats delivered through mutual acquaintances. Her allies in local government suddenly discovered scheduling conflicts that prevented them from intervening on her behalf. Former supporters distanced themselves as additional investigations uncovered connections to building code violations, permit irregularities, and questionable land transfers throughout the county. The community battle lines were drawn, not between neighbors and newcomers, but between honest governance and corrupt power. Multiple homeowners came forward with similar experiences, creating a pattern of evidence that no amount of political connection could dismiss. My property remained technically blocked by the gate during this period, a physical reminder of overreach that had become a powerful symbol in the community. Local news featured it prominently in their coverage. the locked barrier representing the corruption being challenged by ordinary citizens. Regina made one final attempt to undermine my credibility, claiming in a press statement that I had fabricated evidence and manipulated community sentiment for personal gain. Her accusations fell flat the same day. The state attorney general's office announced an expanded investigation into development fraud across multiple counties, with Regina's name prominently featured in the press release. The most satisfying moment came when Thomas and two other board members contacted my attorney requesting meetings to discuss cooperation with investigators in exchange for consideration in the pending cases. The alliance that had seemed unbreakable just months earlier was collapsing under the weight of evidence and accountability. 6 months after that first confrontation with Regina on my property, the case had grown from a simple boundary dispute into one of the largest property fraud investigations in state history. And through it all, the gate, her symbol of power and control, remained standing, its purpose transformed from my imprisonment to the most visible evidence of her crimes. Morning sunlight glinted off the official county seal on the judgment delivered to my mailbox. The thick document contained decisive language that vindicated my fight: immediate cessation of all encroachment, restoration of original property boundaries, financial penalties for documented violations. The court had ruled unanimously in my favor, citing the overwhelming evidence of coordinated fraud. The judgment required the HOA to acknowledge my property boundaries, remove all unauthorized structures, and pay substantial damages for their illegal actions. Most satisfyingly, it ordered the removal of the gate that had become the central symbol of the conflict. Regina's resignation letter circulated through the community before sunset, a terse acknowledgement of differing interpretations of community standards that fooled no one. Her hasty departure from the county followed rumors of criminal charges being prepared by the state attorney general. Her brother-in-law's development company announced the suspension of all local projects pending a corporate restructuring that industry insiders recognized as damage control. The weekend following the judgment brought an unexpected sight. Neighbors I barely knew arriving with tools and determination, offering to help dismantle the gate that had symbolized so much conflict. People who had watched silently during the dispute now appeared with trucks, equipment, and sincere apologies for not speaking up sooner. "We should have said something when they first moved those markers," admitted George Hansen, a retired carpenter who brought his entire workshop of tools. "But they made it seem like anyone who questioned them would be next." The metal groaned as the gate came down section by section, loaded onto trucks for removal. Children too young to understand the significance played on the periphery, their laughter a reminder of community healing already beginning. The concrete footings that had supported the gate required jackhammers and collective effort, a metaphor not lost on anyone present for the work required to remove entrenched corruption. New survey markers, bright orange and legally registered with the county, now stood as sentinels along my true property line. The surveyor, Martin, returned to oversee their placement, ensuring each marker was documented with GPS coordinates and registered with multiple government offices to prevent future tampering. The legal aftermath extended beyond my personal victory. The state investigation expanded to include permit fraud, improper influence over zoning decisions, and financial misconduct across multiple developments. Several officials resigned rather than face ethics investigations. Regina and 3 associates faced criminal charges related to document falsification and misuse of public office. Most surprisingly, the HOA itself survived in a reformed state. After an emergency election to replace the entire board, New leadership committed to transparency and proper governance. The new president, Alina Wright, was a retired ethics professor with a reputation for uncompromising honesty. Coffee with Alina at the local diner felt surreal after months of conflict. Her handshake was firm, her words sincere as she outlined changes already implemented. "We are establishing new procedures to ensure transparency and respect for property rights," she explained, showing me revised bylaws that required documentation of all decisions and limited the power of any single board member. What happened to you cannot happen again. Most meaningful was the neighborhood coalition that formed in the aftermath, homeowners from across the community meeting monthly to review governance procedures and maintain vigilance against power concentration. I became an unofficial advisor, sharing my experience to help others protect their rights. The physical restoration of my land became a personal healing process. I replanted areas damaged during the conflict, rebuilt structures that had been vandalized, and gradually reclaimed the peace that had drawn me here initially. The hidden pathways and secret access points, no longer needed for subterfuge, became charming trails through my property. The gate that had been the centerpiece of Regina's power play, and subsequently my deception strategy, was repurposed. The metal was recycled into boundary markers and a small footbridge spanning the creek at the back of my property, transforming a symbol of division into one of connection. Standing on my back acreage as spring brought new growth, I reflected on the battle that had nearly broken me but ultimately made both me and the community stronger. The legal victory provided justice, but the community's healing offered something more valuable: restoration of trust between neighbors. The land beneath my feet represented more than property now. It symbolized the principle that rights must sometimes be defended with unwavering resolve, that justice requires both courage and strategy, and that even the most elaborate gates cannot stand against the force of truth revealed. Where Regina had seen only monetary value and power, I had found something worth fighting for. Not just land, but the right to live without fear of corruption and intimidation. As the sun set over my fully restored property, I understood that the true victory was not just the removal of a physical gate, but the dismantling of the invisible barriers of fear that had allowed corruption to flourish. Sometimes, the most important battles are fought not just for ourselves, but for the principle that no one should need decoy strategies to protect what is rightfully theirs.